anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Faye Ginsberg. I'm director of the Center for Media, Culture, and History, and I'd like to welcome everyone along with my colleagues in organizing this event. Carrie Barrett from NYU Abu Dhabi, there she is, who runs this beautiful, beautiful space. Greta Schwarnweber from the Hagop Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies. Peggy Dale from the Center for Media, Culture, and History, and Ann Neumann and Angela Zito from the Center for Religion and Media, where I also serve as a co-director. Our event tonight is part of a 2-year initiative entitled Digital Religion, Knowledge, Politics, and Practice that's been funded with very generous support provided by the Henry R. Luce Initiative on Religion and International Affairs, small I, small r. And I'd especially like to welcome Toby Volkman from the Luce Foundation, who's been a very supportive program officer for us. In a moment, I'm going to introduce Havana Marking to you, who will say a few words before we show her latest film, Silencing the Star, an Afghan fallen star that was broadcast on HBO in January 2011. After the film, before opening up for audience questions, we'll start off discussion with two wonderful colleagues who have worked in Afghanistan for many years, David Edwards from Williams College, Department of Anthropology, and Wazhmah Osman, who's in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication here at NYU. And I'll give them fuller introductions after the film when they come up here. So we are really delighted to bring Havana Marking to NYU once again. We had the pleasure of bringing her to campus almost 2 years ago, I think, to show Afghan Star, Havana's first feature documentary that was shot over a 4-month period in Kabul, following the fate of contestants on Afghanistan's version of American Idol. Quick question, how many people have seen Afghan Star? Okay, so we'll do a bit of intro from prior to this one, just to set things up. The first film, that film was the first film from Afghanistan to make it to the prestigious Sundance Film Festival, where it walked off with 2 major awards in 2009 in the World Cinema category for documentary director and for audience awards. The most show-stopping moment in the film was when a young aspiring singer who was in the competition, Satara, was voted off the show. Caught up in the emotion, Satara exuberantly danced across the stage as her headscarf fell to her neck, an act that is still extremely dangerous for women in post-Taliban Afghanistan, which we immediately see in the reactions to her performance. Her act caused an uproar, with many people saying that she, in fact, deserved to be killed for this. In Silencing the Song, Havana visits Satara. She deals with the ever-present threats to her safety, this is following up on what happened, along with a new husband and a baby on the way, and her continuing dreams of becoming a pop idol. As with the prior film, this work was made with Toro TV in Afghanistan, and which we'll talk about a bit in the discussion, and supported by HBO TV in the US, and was broadcast here, as I mentioned, in January of 2011. Prior to this, Havana's worked in the film and TV industry for over 10 years, directing and producing numerous films for theatrical release and TV transmission. Her latest film, which is a BBC and HBO supported production, tells the story of the Pink Panthers, the world's most successful diamond thieves, but as always has a deeper theme with her work: the Balkans, the conflicts, and modern organized crime. She also was executive producer on Hell and Back Again, a double winner at Sundance 2011, Grand Jury and Best Cinematography, and out in cinemas now. Just finished a run at the Film Forum. It's an amazing film that examines the life of a U.S. Marine as he tries to resettle after combat. In addition, she's directed Vote Afghanistan for Channel 4 and produced many films for UK TV, such as my favorite title of the list, War on Terror, What Would Jesus Drive? In 2007, she made a film which I also really love called The Crippendales, which follows the lives of disabled male strippers. And in 2005, you've got quite a lot packed into a few years here. She made The Great Relativity Show, a series of animated shorts that explain the theory of relativity. These won a Pirelli Science Award. Finally, Havana is also a respected journalist and has had articles published in The Guardian, Observer, and The Telegraph. So please join me in welcoming Havana to introduce her film.
Thank you all very much for coming out on a Friday. It's amazing, actually, to see so many people in this lovely room. And thank you very much to NYU Abu Dhabi and everyone who's organised for me to be here. So this is the follow-up film to Afghan Star. It was made for HBO, and it was made specifically to screen after Afghan Star. So it was a kind of, there is an introduction as to who the characters are, but there is a sort of it does help a little bit if you know what happened in the first film. So I'm just going to give you a little upsum of what happened in Afghan Star. So Afghan Star followed a television series made called the same name. It's based on the American Idol or X Factor format. There was a local television channel in Afghanistan called Tolo TV, and they were making it. Afghan Star, my film, followed the third series, which was just when, I mean, if you can imagine, the TV channels there were starting essentially from nothing. The people working had never worked on, majority of people were young kids, sort of 19, 20, 21, who'd never made TV programs before. So the first two series were actually just people learning how to use cameras and learning how to use lights. The third series, the one I filmed, it really had sort of come together. They had a great stage, they had lights coming in from Dubai, and dry ice and everything you need to make a sort of glamorous TV show, and they really had it nailed. Actually very lucky to have a great friend of mine called Rachel Reed in the audience as well, who was the person who put me in touch with Tolo TV in the very first place. And with her, we developed the idea, and knew that it was a very good way into try and understand what young people were thinking and saying in Afghanistan. We knew that in the media, there's endless interviews with the old mujahideen, the political elites, the kind of elders of society who've got the weight of history and the very big weight of very big history on their shoulders. But no one was really talking to the young people. No one was really trying to see what they were thinking. So that was the kind of beginning reason why we wanted to do this. So I followed this series from obviously regional auditions down to the finals at the end, and focused on 4 characters from all different parts, 2 women, 2 men. The woman Satara, who became actually the main character in that first film, is the subject of this second film. She's an incredible young woman, impulsive, reckless, wonderfully kind of courageous, but I think almost sometimes I don't know if her courage comes from because she's actually deliberately doing something that's brave, or just because she can't help herself, because she is an irrepressible character. And thank goodness people like that exist in the world. But contemporary Afghanistan is a dangerous place for people like that to live. So what happened in the first series was she was evicted from the show in the normal kind of terrible, heart-stopping voting scene, with presenters shouting who's winning, who's out, all that stuff. And she's evicted, and in her final performance, she just completely lets go and dances, and while she dances, her headscarf came off, which were 2 things that combined created a big storm, which sort of snowballed in especially from her hometown, because they sort of took it personally that she was representing them, and she had insulted kind of their image and their ideals. And so there became sort of death threats, and she had to go into hiding, and she couldn't go home. And so you'll see what happens there. So just this again, and also if you sort of see this film it's not exactly a narrative film. There's not a sort of bigger story in the way that Afghan Star had a bigger story. It is just about what happened to her afterwards. So things happened to her which we've included, which somehow, when you're looking at it closely, you think, why have they included that? But actually, the bigger picture, I think it just really gives you a real idea of what it's like to be a young woman. As I say, impulsive and a little bit reckless, young woman trying to have a voice in contemporary Afghanistan. So I hope you enjoy the show, and I hope you enjoy the debate afterwards. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
So on my right here, David Edwards is the Van Allen Clark third the 3rd century professor of the social sciences. Well, that's a mouthful. No t-shirt for that one. At Williams College. He's been conducting research on and writing about Afghanistan since 1982, and he's the author of 2 books on Afghanistan. Before the Taliban, Genealogies of the Afghan Jihad, which came out in 2002, and an earlier book, Heroes of the Age, Moral Fault Lines on the Afghan Frontier, along with numerous articles on Afghan history, religion, and culture. He's also the co-director and producer of the film Kabul Transit, which has been part of the official selection at a number of prestigious film festivals, including the Los Angeles Film Festival, the International Documentary Festival in Amsterdam, and the Independence Night series at Lincoln Center in New York City. Since 2001, David Edwards has been also the director of the Williams Afghan Media Project, an archive that includes more than 6,000 photographs and 400 hours of video and spans over 100 years of Afghan history. He's received a number of notable awards, including fellowships from the NEH, as well as Mellon, Fulbright, and the NSF. And in 2002, he was named a Carnegie Scholar by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. He's currently working on a book dealing with the changing relationship between governance, violence, and legitimacy in Afghanistan, and is also starting a new web-based photo and video journal devoted to Afghanistan, which sounds great. Wazhmah, who's on the other end, was born in Kabul and is currently a New York City-based scholar and documentary filmmaker. She has a master's degree in Middle Eastern Studies from NYU, and she's currently completing her PhD in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at NYU. Don't you like to know those words? Currently completing her Her dissertation, Thinking Outside the Box, Television and Gender in the Afghan Culture Wars, is based on a year of ethnographic fieldwork on the fledgling media industry in Afghanistan and neighboring countries, with a particular focus on issues of gender. Prior to her academic career, she worked for 6 years at Millennium Film Workshops and Cooper Union School of the Arts as a film instructor and curator. Her short film, Buried Alive, Afghan Women Under the Taliban, was widely circulated by numerous human rights organizations. And her critically acclaimed 2007 feature, Postcards from Tora Bora, has screened in film festivals nationally and internationally. So thanks so much for joining us and bringing your expertise to the commentary. So we're going to have our speakers speak to the film and bring their broader knowledge to it. If you feel so moved, Havana, you can then respond to it, and then we'll open up. So you can start thinking about questions you might want to ask. So David, we'll start with you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Faye, for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here, and what a wonderful center you've got. This is amazing.
Wait, this is Abu Dhabi.
Well, but you have your hands in lots of pies, and
I know who to collaborate with.
I want to just talk a little bit, before talking about this film, I want to talk a little bit about Afghan Star, which is a film that I very much admire. And the reason I admire it, there's several, and I want to talk a little bit about that, but in general, I think so many films dealing with Afghanistan, and I go back here to the period before September 11th, and so many films dealing with Afghanistan seem to narrow our understanding of the country, narrow it down to a few kinds of tropes, a few oppositions, and impressions that make Afghan society feel barbaric, feel brutal, feel like it's the Taliban against women, feel like it's a few sorts of factors are dominating the whole landscape of the country. And I think there are other films, and they're few in number, that instead of narrowing our understanding, they widen it. And I think one thing that Havana mentioned briefly in her introduction was that she wanted to present a portrait of the young people of Afghanistan and not go back one more time to the warlords and to the people who have brutalized the country. And I think that's certainly one thing that she does in the film, but I think there's others too, and I apologize to those of you who haven't seen Afghan Star, but I think it's worth it to contextualize this film in order to better understand it. And I want to just mention a couple of other things that I think Afghan Star accomplishes. One is that by focusing on what might seem a trivial topic, the American Idol goes to Afghanistan in Afghan Star, that it's focusing on kind of a superficial pop culture-y sort of thing, but I think it's important to understand what pop culture, that it didn't really exist, not like this before, and how the implications of having a show like that in Afghanistan. in a sense, I think you can see, keep in mind that the dynamic of the show is, first of all, it's broadcast on Tolo TV, on television, but then there's another aspect of it, which is the voting via text messaging, via cell phones, which everybody has. And it's a kind of interesting, we tend to focus on participatory democracy in relationship to political leaders, but this is also another form of participatory democracy that you see in action. And it's an interesting one that's mediated by the media. And one of the things you see in Havana's film is that people tend, there are fewer TVs than there are cell phones in Afghanistan, and people tended to watch the show communally in groups, but then they also had this other dynamic where they could actually participate and in some ways inform the outcome of what was going to happen. That, to me, is a fascinating aspect of the change that's going on in Afghanistan. Another, I think, has to do with the changing nature of the public sphere in Afghanistan. I went there for the first time in 1975 when I was a English teacher in Kabul. And at that point, there wasn't TV, there was radio. And two of the most popular performers, if you will, the ancestors of Satara, were a man named Nashanas and a woman named Magwash. And Nashanas was one of the most popular singers at the time, and the name Nashanas means the unknown. And the story that's told about Nashanas is that he adopted this name because his family didn't approve of him appearing in public as a singer. So this was his pseudonym that he used as a way to hide his identity. Magwash, on the other hand, is a woman, and one of the things that if you go to her Wikipedia page, you'll see she is known as Ustad Magwash, and there's a lot of emphasis placed on her lineage as an artist, the people she was trained by and who she learned from. And if you go to her own website, you'll see there's a video of her, and she's very pious. She is wearing a headscarf. She's reading Rumi, and this is all kind of contextualizes the song that she's about to sing in terms of the kind of pious woman that she was. Those were two of the kind of ways in which pop music and pop culture began to be introduced in Afghanistan. There was also another person worth mentioning, which is, I'm sure every Afghan knows, Ahmed Zaire, who in a sense was the true precursor to the people you see in Afghan Star, really the first Afghan pop celebrity who met a bad end, but that's another story. But I think it is interesting to realize how recent this change of public sphere was in Afghanistan, even the existence of the public sphere. The fact that in Kabul now the show is shown at a wedding hall. There are very few dedicated places where a show like this could even be mounted. Another thing that I really like about the film is that it tells a story, and an entertaining story, but it does so without, in a sense, oversimplifying. I mean, one of the dangers of all film, and almost an inevitability of film, is that it simplifies. But by focusing on these four characters, the two boys, Rafi and Hamid, and Lima, the woman from Kandahar, and Satara, who we've seen in this film, from Herat, it does a number of things. One is that they happen to be all from different ethnic groups, and it talks about, in a way you see, even if indirectly, at least it provides a talking point for understanding how these ethnic groups are beginning to work together and even begin to have a sense of nationhood, a sense of common identity. And I think it's particularly interesting is the relationship in the film, the first film, between Lima, the woman from Kandahar, who is in the Magwash style in terms of a more pious, more careful, not dancing, not being overly expressive while she's singing. And Satara, who is, as you've seen, and as Havana has described her, a reckless presence. And I think one of the things that by seeing these two women together, you see that there are alternate ways of being in this public space, of women performing. But I think it also indicates that it broadens out the understanding of what is, in crude terms, understood in America as the oppression of women in Afghanistan. And I think one of the things why Satara created the kind of a backlash that she did, I think we tend to think of it in very crude terms, but I think what it was above all else was about modesty and the expectation in a culture of honor that men and women will act in a certain way, will perform in a certain way that does not draw attention to themselves, but draws attention to the music and to what they're trying to express. And Satara, I think, crosses that line. And I think that even seeing the relationship between her and Lima helps to bring that into a full view. And this is, I want to just continue now and talk a little bit about this film and also offer my thought about why it also worries me a little bit. Particularly when you see this film in isolation without seeing the first film. In a sense, this is a problem. This isn't exactly a classic kind of cinema verite observational film, but it is closer to that style than it is certainly to a documentary that you see on broadcast television. There is a narrative, but it tells its own story. But this is a problem that I, as an anthropologist and a professor, have all the time in thinking about, and this is something that my Greg Whitmore, who worked with me as the co-director of the Kabul Transit, and I dealt with, which is how do you, when your audience is different than the people who you're filming, how do you maintain a kind of observational, non-narrative, non-directed style and leave that responsibility to interpretation to people who don't really understand that culture? I mean, it's a really enormous problem. It's a lot easier when you're Frederick Wiseman looking at American culture, where you have some guidelines to understand about how a film needs to be interpreted to be understood. I think it's trickier, much trickier, particularly in a situation like Afghanistan, where we're involved in a war, where we have so many preconceptions, so many stereotypes that are that we have to that are already out there. You're not dealing with a naked terrain. You're dealing with very much an occupied terrain, and I think it makes it difficult. And so we come to the figure of Satara, and how do we interpret who this woman is? And Havana mentioned that she's reckless, and I can imagine that there's lots of different ways in which we might interpret this woman and her actions. I can imagine that a lot of people would see her as heroic / tragic, as some kind of combination of a heroic artist who has this tragic result to her simple pursuit of her art at all costs. But I also try to imagine how Afghans might interpret the same person. And I can imagine, for example, that, first of all, that immodesty would inform a lot of people. Obviously, there are people who support her. There are people who come up to her, particularly in Kabul. And one of the things that also is that's in the background of the story that we don't really, and I think it was really impossible for Havana to really talk about, is that one of the major divides in Afghanistan is really between Kabul and the rest of the country, between the urban space and the rural space. And so often that divide has been the tripwire that has led to the collapse of reform efforts in Afghanistan, going back to the 1920s all through the 1960s, the collapse of the communist regime in 1979-80 when it first failed to win the hearts and minds of its people. And so Afghans, when they see Satara, I wonder how they interpret it. How they have interpreted it, because I don't think we really know fully from the film. And I also wonder with the last scene of the baby, how that's the mother indicates that maybe this is bad magic that's been responsible, but I can see a lot of Afghans also saying this is divine judgment for this woman for what's happened to her. My point here is to say that there's lots of ways to interpret this woman's story. And because this is an observational film, it leaves some opening for us to come to those terms. But I think my fear is that in the present climate, particularly now with people really looking for every excuse to pull back from Afghanistan and engagement with this country, that the way in which it will be interpreted is as another sign, in a sense, the narrowing down the way that I described film early on in the Taliban era as narrowing our understanding of Afghanistan. And my worry, and this is not at all a criticism of the filmmaker, but rather a kind of more commentary in the times in which we live, that there may be a narrowing down, and this kind of story is the kind of story that may lead people to say, this is a barbaric society, that this is a hopeless cause, we are so different from them and us from, they from us and us from them, that there really is little grounds for communication between them. So I'll just leave that. And
Thank you. While you were, I just seeing a lot of people who are standing. I wonder if you guys here could make a little pathway for people who might want to try and come in and sit over here. There's space, and I think a couple of chairs have opened up. If there's an empty chair next to you, can you lift your hand? Oh, never mind, they're getting filled very quickly. Okay, so if you guys in the hall want to come over here, if you could just give them a little pathway here. Okay, Havana, do you want to respond to anything before we go to Wazhmah? Or you...
Well, yeah, just.
Yeah, is there, that little button has to turn green. There we go. Oh, there we go.
Okay. In a way, the way that I interpreted Satara by the end, or the situation of Satara, was not that, in a sense, that the society was so barbaric that she was in this situation. Actually, to me, I became quite sort of. It was the first time that I really, really, truly understood why women in societies like that cannot stand up and say exactly what they want and do exactly what they want to do. Because when you go, you're like, why aren't women getting together and telling anyone to, why is the feminism not taking hold here? Why can't people just say, whatever? Because when a country is as poor as that, when healthcare is as poor as that, you cannot rock the boat, because you will be in Satara's situation where you are alone and there is no one to look after you, and it's life or death. If she hadn't done the dancing, the steps, back, there would be her family, there would be his family, there would be people supporting her, and as it was, because of those things she was dealing with all of that basically alone. She couldn't go back to Herat because, as we've seen, the difference between Herat and Kabul. Kabul was the only place that was safe for her. So to me, the feeling that I really felt after that is that basically economics and development comes first before gender can change. Before gender equality can happen, there needs to be a situation so that people can rock the boat, can be alone, and can still get help. To me, that was the lesson that I drew.
Thank you. Okay, Wazhmah.
So mine is on, right? The green?
Yeah, the green's good.
I'm sorry, I apologize because I'm going to read, and I'm not that good at not reading speeches. I want to start by thanking Faye Ginsburg, who has been my advisor and mentor since I started at NYU way back. I'm grateful for Faye's spirit and scholarship, which infuses all of my work, but I also want to take full responsibility for any errors and my own opinions.
And I see we didn't give you a water glass, so.
I put it over there somewhere.
Okay, is there a water glass? We'll look for that one. Here we go.
Thank you.
See, after she flattered me, I'm like.
it's a full service department here.
Flattery always works. So my presentation today is based on over 100 interviews I conducted during my 2009-2010 year-long fieldwork in Afghanistan and neighboring countries for my dissertation, Thinking Outside the Box, Television and Gender in the Afghan Culture Wars. My dissertation is primarily a production study with high and low-level television employees at all of Afghanistan's 33 broadcast television stations. I also had to engage in reception studies to gauge what audiences value about television programs and if they see a reflection of the issues that are important to their daily lives. Despite a precarious political situation in post 9/11 Afghanistan, okay, is it too loud? Is this better? Okay, I'm sorry about that. A new configuration of resources from a combination of foreign, domestic, private, and public sources has enabled an unprecedented proliferation of media Television, more specifically the televisual representation of women and women's rights, debates about democracy, modernity, and the role of Islam have instigated a series of escalating battles amongst Islamists, moderates, and others. It is within this broader context that I want to situate Havana Marking's films and Tolo television. Gender has always been a contentious issue in Afghanistan. Islamic and pre-Islamic Persian and tribal practices and customs such as Nang, Niknami, Sanginis, Namus, Bad exchange is at the heart of why Afghans are very sensitive and reverent to the concepts of shame and honor. As feminist scholars have shown, it is through such gender contestations that attempts at setting and defining national, cultural, social identity, often in the singular, occur. And as feminist media scholars have shown, this is especially the case if women are in the public sphere and or public figures in the media. This is no different in Afghanistan, except the stakes are much higher. Over 3 decades of war has fostered a special culture of violence, impunity, and rise of fanatical, misogynist, conservative fascism. That's a mouthful. In the name of religion and culture. The roots of this dystopic phenomena are intricately embedded in the politics of the Cold War and the war on terror, which I don't have time to get into, but let's just say that for the Taliban and other extremist groups, issues pertaining to Afghan women have become an even more contentious symbol of nationhood and a new marker of the jihad against the West and local Afghan reformers. In other words, the terrain of gender discourse over the chadar or veiling, purdah, the separation of men and women, singing, dancing, and other expressions of female sexuality, which were becoming relative non-issues before the wars, have become highly politicized, volatile, and violent. It is within this extremely dangerous arena that brave Afghan reformers, both women and men, challenge oppressive forces to reclaim a more just culture. Oftentimes, though, these women's decisions to work on screen and television is determined as much by their socioeconomic predicaments as it is by their courage to fight for women's rights and or artistic freedom. Roya Sadat, the director of Afghanistan's first dramatic serial, Razhai in Khana, produced by Tolo Television, explains how difficult it was for them to find any actresses for the program. After holding several auditions where only men would show up, they began to solicit in poor neighborhoods in Kabul. Abada, one of the main protagonists of the serial, took the job not because she had a desire for acting or to be a star, but out of sheer desperation. She was married as a child bride to an abusive, opium-addicted older husband and has many children, including including an ill child to support. Likewise, most of the female contestants on Afghan Star come from underprivileged backgrounds. In May of 2005, Shaima Riazi, the 24-year-old host of a popular music video call-in show called Hop on Tolo Television, was shot in the head and killed in her own home. In March of that year, Tolo had fired her on the basis of unprofessionalism, but many of her fans believed that she was scapegoated to appease the pressure from the Shura of Ulama. Rezai was an Azara and a Shia, an ethnic and religious minority in Afghanistan. In May of 2007, Shakiba Sangha Hamaj, a 22-year-old presenter and reporter for the Pashto language television station Shamshad TV, was shot and killed by a gunman also in her own home. She was from a poor Pashtun family in the northwest frontier. Both were classified as Qatl Namus, which roughly translates as honor killings because they brought shame to their families. It is difficult to ascertain whether these two cases, despite being classified as honor killings, are actually honor killings, since the label is oftentimes an easy way for the authorities and families to evade responsibility. These are just 2 cases out of many media-related crimes and murders, but no arrests are made and no one is prosecuted in most of these cases, including the ones mentioned. As brave as these female media personalities are, their low socioeconomic status, despite or maybe because of their high profile, leaves them vulnerable to abuse and death. The owners of television stations likewise are quick to absolve themselves of any responsibility for the murders of their female employees. Faisal Karim Faisal, the owner of Shamshad TV, echoes almost exactly what Said Musaini, one of the sibling owners of Tolo TV, said in regards to the deaths, that it was a family affair. Mohammad Dai Foladi, the manager of the religious-leaning private television station Nigah, asks during my interview, "Tell me what Afghan Star has done for Afghan women. Who has really profited from such programs? Has it really elevated the position of women in our society, or even elevated the discussion? He goes on to explain how in this highly politicized gender environment, quote, women have become a project for many television stations to seek international funding, or worse, raise the stakes and create sensationalism for the sake of advertising money, end quote. Anyone who's familiar with Afghan history knows that the long struggle for women's rights has been an ongoing battle between modernist state policies and the more restrictive and repressive interpretations of Islamic law and tribal laws. As such, women's lives and bodies have been under the jurisdiction and regulation of tribal and religious elders and historically relegated to the private sphere. In this respect, contrary to Daifoladi and other critics of Tolo, I believe that the representations of Afghan women in programs such as Afghan Star serve multiple functions. Even the deaths of television personalities are not completely in vain. Ordinarily, such incidences would be considered a private matter and brushed under the carpet in a small village, and nobody would have known about them. Yet because they are public figures, they bring attention to and encourage debate about these issues through television. It is precisely this public engagement with cultural and political issues pertaining to human rights, democracy, and nation building that is a source of strife for the Islamists and other conservative extremist groups, and a celebration for the defenders of free media in Afghanistan. Yet it is for the same reasons that I also believe Daifoladi raises important questions. If the goal of a television station really is to improve the position and status of Afghan women, shouldn't their internal policies reflect the dedication to women? In other words, what safeguards does the station have in place to ensure women's safety both in the workplace and outside? Also, demographically speaking, how many Afghan women, both on-screen and off-screen, do the station staff? High-level media personnel and wealthy media owners are oftentimes prominent public figures who can safeguard their own security, while low-level employees bear the burden of developing media independence by exposing abuses of power by warlords, critiquing foreign powers and the national government, and airing diverse lifestyles, cultures, and televisual representations of women. ISAF, NATO, and the American forces tried to protect telecommunication towers from the Taliban by either placing them within the compound walls of their military bases or having soldiers guard them. It is time to also protect the flesh and blood people who run the one institution with the most democratic potential to protect people. Television owners, the Afghan government, and the international community must be held accountable for the safety of Afghan journalists, presenters, singers, and actresses. This isn't just a problem of personal safety, but the future of independent media and women's rights in Afghanistan depends on it. Currently, self-censorship is becoming a prevalent problem amongst media makers. Once the venues for mass communication and mediation are controlled and censored by direct force and/or fear and intimidation, cultural debates cease to serve the public and appease only the elites. I'd like to conclude by presenting some alternative models for Afghan TV channels to elevate the discussion. There are many television programs in Afghanistan that have female hosts, newscasters, and reporters. They usually do not come under attack because they tend to be more culturally sensitive, yet still elevate the position of women. For example, there's a popular TV program called Challenge, hosted by a chadar-clad and conservatively attired Zara Seper. Seper challenges some of the most powerful politicians, religious clerics, and warlords on her weekly show. Her interviewing style is both subtle and incredibly astute and incisive. The discussions that Challenge inspires tend to be the topic of water cooler, or in Afghanistan's case, chai khanas the next day. As we have seen, of course, television is capable of stirring cultural contestations, but it also has the ability, if not the responsibility, to raise awareness around those same controversies and ensuing violence instead of shying away from them. When violence towards journalists and/or women occur, many television stations have taken the bold steps of televising the details of the incidents. Sabah TV, for example, has a program called Roshani, or In Light, that is entirely focused on the meaning of human rights and also human rights violations. RTA, the national broadcasting channel, has a program called Crime Scene Investigation. As you can tell, they really like English names, like Challenge and Crime Scene Investigation. It's a real-life investigation program that looks into real crimes. In one episode, they investigated the self-immolation of a woman. Self-emulation happens to be one of the top 5 biggest problems facing Afghan women right now. They examined the details of the incident and also interviewed all the people involved. Based on the evidence, including the interviews, they accused her husband of domestic violence as the main cause of the woman attempting to kill herself. He was publicly shamed and dishonored. This is an example of television serving the public at its best, and how cultural codes like shame and honor can also be used for the benefit of marginalized and vulnerable populations.
Thank you both so much for writing it out. Havana, before we open the floor, do you want to respond at all to Wazhmah? I just want to point out that it was so interesting that you had your security person, right, who was playing with their guns. Just for all you independent filmmakers who think you have it hard, did you put a budget line in for your security person? So, I mean, I just even in your own experience, clearly security has been a big issue. So I don't know if you want to link it back to Wazhmah or talk about your own experience. Carrie, put in probably the button.
No, it's okay. I'll put it.
It should
stay on.
I mean, I can only really talk about Afghanistan. I can't talk about the other programs or what happened to other women, things. And it's true that the 2 women, Lima and Satara, obviously we've seen what happened to Satara. Lima, I don't know what happened to her next. She apparently fled to Pakistan afterwards, and there were lots of rumours that she'd been killed, that maybe it was a family affair, that she'd shamed her family and whatever, but there was also rumours that she'd won prize money and therefore people were trying to sort of kidnap and get ransom money, which is quite an income, way of generating income there. So, but once you lose someone's mobile phone number, you lose track of them basically forever in that sort of situation. So there's absolutely no way of knowing what really did happen. And there is an awful lot of gossip all the time where, I mean, people thought Satara had been killed and gossip would fly around the place that she'd been killed a lot of times when actually she hadn't been. So who knows? But obviously it does happen and women are killed, so it's impossible to know. And in terms of Tolo's responsibility, once they're off the show, they're off the show, they're out of Tolo's scope. I should just say that Satara, by the way, it's not as awful as that film, which is just so awful. Watching it again, it's just so awful. But she has now got political asylum in Germany, so at least she's out of there. Because I mean, she is, as I said, reckless. There are moments when you see her talking to her husband, talking to people, which make you wince. You know, when you know how men and women interact, you're just like, oh, Satara, please don't say that. Please, you don't need to say it like that. You don't need to insult him again, just for your own safety. So, you know, I'm very glad that she is now somewhere safe. It's not, being a refugee is not also a wonderful path, paved with gold, but it's anyway, she's alive, so that's everything.
Hi, Sarah Flynn. I'm a student at NYU. I just actually have 2 questions. I'm very sorry. The first one is for any of you. I'm not sure who can answer this. But I remember the first film, as a point of clarity, it said that after a lot of the discourse, especially religious discourse, occurred after Satara danced on stage, it said that I believe that they banned dancing on television. However, one of the people interviewed said that they watched Shakira and Jennifer Lopez, and obviously Satara was nothing like that. And then later in this film, we also saw music videos on television. I wasn't sure if the ban was just for Afghan television. Okay.
Well, it's for Afghan people.
Okay.
If you're a non-Afghan, you can dance.
And they can watch other non-Afghanistans?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Then my other question is actually for you, and I was just wondering what sort of reactions Satara's parents faced after this. I know we got a little bit of some other reaction to this, saying that she raised her as being very strong-willed, but I was wondering about her father, even her mother a little bit more, or sisters, especially afterward. I know fingers overshadowed, but I thought that they thought that she was dead, but you could expand that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't go and see her family when we were making this follow-up film, but I did during the Afghan Star production and their interviews with her. I mean, her family were incredibly proud of her, and saw themselves as liberal. As an example of that, one of their daughters had married someone from a different ethnic group. That's an indication, I think, that they weren't as traditionally minded as others. And cultured, they saw themselves as cultured in that way. They were worried for her, but also I think they'd known. Obviously, Satara was born how she was born, and had obviously been making her own path since she was a tiny little girl, and they sort of stopped trying to make her do things, in the way that her sisters might have done, or other women might have been. I think she went to school during the Taliban time. She went to all the sort of secret schools when they were educated in sort of own scenarios, and could have again risking her lives at that time for doing that. So Satara and her family's attitude to her was always, we can't stop her doing what she wants to do. I think they're pretty unique. Well, say that. Actually, they're not. Lots of women went to those secret schools. I mean, Satara is unique, and there are not very many women in this, vocalizing in the way that Satara was, and shocking in the way that Satara was. But actually, something probably I think to respond to, I think there has to be scope. If you're going to have a media and you're going to have a representative, you do need to have women of all. You need to have the women who are conservative and supporting in a way the rights of the respectable woman. But you need to have Satara, she's way pushing the boundaries, dangerously, and you fear for her so much. But if you don't have women doing that, then the respectable women can't do it either. There's room for everyone.
I would take some issue with that, and I do so for this reason. The achievements in the quieter achievements that have been often overshadowed in the last 10 years, particularly in terms of women's education and healthcare, can be undone so easily. And I think one of the dangers, you don't want to coddle religious extremists or accept them as the arbiters of moral right and wrong in Afghanistan. At the same time, if you look at Afghan history, there is a series of episodes that have happened that have, I would call them maybe cultural tripwires. An example in 1928 when King Amanullah, the king at that time, who was a reformer, tried to send a group of schoolgirls abroad for education, and photographs and knowledge and gossip about these girls went everywhere, that they were going to become whores, and that kind of incident again and again in Afghan history has led to backlashes that have undone the very fragile achievements of reformists. And so, on the one hand, I get your point and I accept it, but I think it also, responsibility in Afghanistan is so much more complicated, and it's not just about individuals. I think we have a tendency to view everything from the point of view of the individual, and in Afghanistan, it doesn't work that way. And I think that individuals implicate through their actions wide networks of other people, through kinship and through people that they've never had any contact with. And I think by over kind of romanticizing the artist, which is a very Western conceit, it's a very Western idea, and I understand it and I glory in it as well in our own culture, but to impose it on Afghanistan, or as I think in some ways Tolo TV is doing, in arguably an irresponsible way, they could become another one of those tripwires that undoes the fragile achievements that have been accomplished in the last few years.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. I didn't want to sound like a mullah or a Taliban or anything. Like, I'm not saying that the only types of representations of women should be these very modest, status quo types of things. I just think that the way the political economy of television works, especially with certain TV stations, is such that these women can be, and you know, Satara says this herself, that, you know, they become what we say qurbani, or they become a sacrifice. And so in that respect, I think because there should be room, as Havana said, for all types of representations, but because these women are pushing the culture and they're making strides towards all kinds of progressive things, that there needs to be a level of responsibility by the government, the international community, and the TV owners especially. And I think when I was talking about elevating the discussion, I think TV can be instrumental in not just creating these uproars, but having discussions. For example, and some of the people who didn't see Afghan Star, you know, texting is something they talk about and how that's very democratic, and this is the first time that many Afghans have voted. But I think even something like texting, that kind of technology can be used to, you know, if there's some kind of talk show where they discuss, as I gave some examples, you know, what Afghans think about these cultural codes, be it shame or honor or whatever, and people to actually text their opinions instead of just voting on who's the best singer. That elevates the discussion, so that way you're pushing the culture in two ways, you know?
I would suggest that maybe a good collaboration for the two of you would be to do a film about Tolo TV in the mode of Control Room, the film about Al Jazeera. That would be a really fascinating institutional study of how these decisions get made and the interaction of people behind the scenes, behind the cameras. It would be really very interesting. So I'm just throwing that idea out to you.
Good. Any funders in the audience?
Oh, sorry, I didn't ask questions. But
Can you hold on a second? Can you all hear Havana? Yeah. Okay, good. I can't tell how the. Yeah, if you can get it slightly closer to your mic. Thanks.
when Satara danced, and the show doesn't go out as live, it goes as live, so it goes 12 hours later. So they can choose what they show and what they don't show. And when she danced and when the headscarf fell off, and I asked them, are you going to put that out? And they absolutely were like, yes, why not? It would be an insult to Satara not to put that out. And yes, it probably did do, in terms of ratings, in the debate around Satara, it probably did increase the scandal, the sort of ratings. But it also, life is very tough for Tolo as well. They're constantly threatened being closed down, and it would be much easier for them not to do that. So there's two ways of looking at it. In the next series, when Satara went on to do a guest appearance, she was wearing a miniskirt, and they absolutely didn't show that, and they absolutely told all their performers they must not dance. The law had changed since then. So they had been chastened, I think, a little bit by what had happened. They were changing their, just trying to work out. It's such a fine line for everyone, and everyone's making it up as they go along, really, as to what they show and how they show it, and what they push and what they don't push. And I think everyone's trying to sort of learn what happens.
Good. Okay, I'm going to maybe do take 3 questions on the floor, so you guys have to be extremely alert to pay attention, and then we'll just so we can get some opinions out. Okay, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to start here, Zoe. If you want to just maybe stand up and say your name.
Yeah, I'm Zoe. I'm doing a PhD here in the Cinema Studies Department, and I'm really interested actually in asking you about the international co-production and talking about responsibility from the TV station in Afghanistan. But what kind of capacity does the international community or yourself as a filmmaker and was it HBO or BBC?
This one was HBO. The Afghanistan was with Chapel.
In terms of pushing those kind of sort of question of ethics or safety of performers in the context of your own film and with these co-producers, how does that get negotiated and how does that get discussed?
Okay, you're going to hold that for 1 minute. We're going to get a couple questions on the floor here. So, yes, Becker.
Hi, my name is
2016, I was actually working as a research assistant, so I worked closely with her. I myself am doing research with Afghan women in diaspora, and they really like films like these where there's a view on Afghan women, and reacted kind of negatively because, you know, they don't agree that, you know, they are a certain way, and they feel very, at least the ones I kind of worked with, felt very like one-dimensional. And you can't help it, like you were referring to earlier, how do you navigate that? So I was just wondering if you ever interacted with women after Afghan women after they saw your film, and what they felt about it.
Okay, so we'll take those two for right now, and we'll take more. Okay, so the ethics and the audience response. Okay.
The first question is a bit complicated, really. I'm not 100% sure about it afterwards. In terms of like HBO or Channel 4, in terms of funding me to make my film, they wouldn't have any view on the ethics of what happened to Satara, in the sense that I'm making a film about Satara. Their responsibility, I suppose, is that I'm okay while I'm making a film about Satara. Does that make sense? In terms of their actual responsibility. But at the same time, how you show and they have to trust you as a filmmaker, that you are not putting that person in danger, or that you are, you know, working, you know, to make sure that your position there is not making things worse or changing the reality. Of course, millions of debates about does the camera change reality, of course it does a bit, but so yeah, there were lots of discussions about, you know, for example, me going to Herat with Satara in the first film, where she was sort of in hiding. Would our presence draw more attention to her, or would it protect her? In the end, we decided that actually in that particular case, it was better for us to be there, and I genuinely think we did. I think that actually what Satara's main problem is she's scared about the physical threats to her life, but more pressing and more problems to Satara was the loneliness and the emotional alienation that she was constantly feeling, and her mental stability was actually more at risk than her sort of physical being, and so us being there actually was very good for her. Whereas Lima, we never went to Kandahar with Lima, because our presence would have definitely drawn attention to her and made it much more difficult for her. So, you know, that's an example of decisions that were made that are based on those things. The film Afghan Star hasn't, this actually leads nicely to the next question, in that Afghan Star hasn't been shown in Afghanistan. That was a decision made right at the beginning. The women that were in the film didn't want the film to be shown. They don't care what people in the US think, but they do care what their neighbour thinks. And so that was the decision made. Satara's family, for example, made that request. So I hope that helps a little bit. In terms of, I actually haven't had sort of. I'd be really interested to hear what people had said about women and what age group they were from. But I've shown it in the UK anyway to quite a lot of young Afghans who have all actually responded really positively. But then you don't know, they might be saying that just to me because everyone's very polite. No one in Afghanistan really likes to offend anyone. That's part of the culture. So I don't know. Young kids, there's strong Afghan communities in certain areas of London or whatever, and we've shown in schools there, and the reactions have been fantastic. And going up to teenagers and stuff, we've thanked me actually for showing an alternative side, for showing what the young people think. But I don't know what older women think. I haven't had that in particular. So I'd be interested to hear.
Okay. We've got this down in the back. Yeah, you can stand and say your name.
My name is Scott Kaplan. I live in this area, and I'd like to ask: do the principles embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is that a Western concept, or is that universal limitation on the ability and rights of governments to do things to citizens regardless of cultural norms? And if the latter, does the international community have an obligation to impose safeguards should the Taliban come back to power?
Okay, hold that thought, and we're going to do another one. Yeah, okay, yeah.
I have a music-related question. The Afghan Star program, were they singing original songs or were they singing cover? And the real question is, there is the popular music industry of Afghanistan. Are they outside the country or inside? Because I remember Professor Edwards compared these singers, the contestants in this program, with the legitimate professional pop music performers in the previous era. So I just wanted to say that the comparison may not be completely accurate. And I was wondering where the original stars whose music they're performing are, and what is the standard of behavior for them.
Okay, so we've got human rights and music, so. Okay.
I'm happy to do the second answer, but the second question, please bring me first.
Well,
And she's got jet lag, so thank goodness we got some.
I mean, it's a important question. It's a well articulated question. It may be the wrong venue to get into it because it's a panel of its own to really do justice to it. And it's complicated because I think without question historically it is a product of the West, and that isn't to say that it doesn't have the potential to be a universal declaration that people can buy into, but there's it's historically it did come out of a particular tradition, and I think furthermore there's the additional problem of even if it is adhered to, believed in universally, what role do different governments have in terms of intervention? I mean, this is obviously central to the pretext of our involvement in Afghanistan right now. So I don't want to shortchange your question, but I think there's no possibility except to shortchange it, given that the focus tonight should be on the film and the issues I think more directly that it brings up. And obviously some of those issues are brought up and we've touched on them at least. But so. I guess I'll leave it at that.
Okay, and the music?
I was just going to add, I think some of the idea of human rights, not in those exact words, but also are indigenous to Afghanistan to a certain extent, because one of the shows I mentioned is an alternative, Sabah TV, and their show Roshani, they talk about human rights. And so there is a word, ak, which comes from Islam, which means rights. And so people, they did a survey, Sabah TV actually they also have a newspaper version of their TV program, and they did a survey, and so people have a very, strong understanding of their rights. And so maybe it's not, I think Professor Edwards is right, it's not conceptualized in the same way as human rights, but there is this sense of different type of rights. Yeah.
Great. Okay. And anyone want to take the music one?
I'll just from the people that were in the show. Most of what they were singing were cover songs, and actually most of them came from Ahmadzai, who's been mentioned, and there wasn't really the space for people to do original compositions. So Satara had written some of her own songs, for example, but the bands didn't know them, and it was much easier for everyone to do covers. It was quite interesting which songs they chose, depending on one of the performers would choose songs. He was from the Hazara ethnic group, and he would always choose songs about how we should all be brothers, and had a song about I am a Muslim but I'm in love with a Hindu, which is pretty sort of like, just like a choice. It was like, oh, okay, that's actually a very interesting choice and actually quite symbolic of X, Y, Z. What I think that the program definitely did do, taking it away, not looking at the politics of the program, what the program definitely did was kickstart the contemporary Afghan music scene. There were loads of young Afghans who were suddenly auditioning or wanting to be on the show, but not knowing, I had no training in music at all because instruments had been broken, whatever, and we're going and getting lessons and we're learning how to sing in Afghan, Afghan classical music or whatever. And that was a rather amazing thing because Tolo is a whole media empire and they have radio stations, and when they started after 2001, they had no contemporary Afghan music to play. There are Afghans actually in the diaspora, but no sort of locally produced. So this was a way for them to kind of create, pop stars, contemporary pop stars, and have music that they could play and that people would listen to.
I think some of the Afghans in the audience, I'm sure Wazhmah knows much better than I, but there is a big gap between Nashanos and Magwash in the 70s and now. And there was music going on. I think a lot of it, my understanding, a lot of it was produced in diaspora and in the overseas communities in the Bay Area and in Long Beach and in Germany and other places where there are large concentrations of Afghans. And as I understand it, a lot of the music, there was music going on. A lot of it derived from traditional ghazals and other forms. But so I think that this is a kind of interesting new phenomenon, not only because it's taking place in Afghanistan, but it's also so mediated by pop music, and also Afghans coming back, having been influenced by the genres that they've listened to overseas as well. Are you know more probably than any of us about this?
I mean,
put you on the spot or anything.
Please represent your generation.
I think, I'm looking at television, but as Professor Edwards said, there was a vibrant community of musicians in Afghanistan in the 70s as well, but they circulated mostly on the radio. The television in Afghanistan began in 77, and so there wasn't, the circulation of these songs, as outrageous as they might be in content and what it's implying, were sometimes poetic and maybe sometimes not as direct, and so it didn't outrage people in the same way as the music videos and the televisual representations are.
Great, thanks. Carrie, can we do one more set of questions? Okay, yeah, we just, so we're going to do one more set of questions, and then I think, is there a reception? Yeah, so you can mingle with the people here. There's a lovely reception downstairs, so you can ask those questions one-on-one if you don't get a chance to here. So, okay, I'm going to do, Carol, do you want to stand and say your name?
Carol Lazio, and I'm an independent media scholar. I have a reception question in relation to the original program. It didn't seem as though the main character was voted on near the top. So I'm curious about why any of you interpret the fact that she did get voted off. So I won't say quickly because I don't know but not so far off. And then was it her performance or was it her skill? In other words, was it the objection to her behavior or was it her singing ability? And the other related question that I understood, did I understand that the more traditional one had some backlash as well? So I'm very curious about why that should have happened if she was abiding by the norms.
Okay, hold that for 1 second. One last person to do. Yes, you've been standing the whole time. You get to ask a question.
Okay. This is Carolyn, recently graduate of the International Education here at NYUAD. And just sort of a general question. You sort of talked about how Afghan stars and people are paving the way and sort of needed certain ways, but concerns about the quality of the narrative discussion and debate that's kind of creating opportunity for. What do you think is potential for the kind of show that has been talked about? There's something a little bit more rich and political and social dialogue. As somebody who has experience the commercial aspect of this, do you think that there's appetite audience that Afghanistan for the show? Do you think there's a little behind that?
I'm just curious.
Okay, so the first question was about the dynamics of how people got voted off and what happened to Lima, the other singer, and the potential for this genre. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, sort of the next step in a show like this, something that might sort of be more along the lines of political, social issues.
Okay, so where this kind of work might evolve. Okay, great. So
So Satara, yeah, she was voted off in the top 8. That was the sort of 8th. She's the 8th. I can't work out how to say that. She wasn't 8th, but she was the other way around.
we need to get Havana another cup of tea.
And you know, there's no question she was a controversial character right from the start, and she had a very sort of. There were lots of people supported her, but not nearly enough. And whereas Lima, for example, made it to the top 3.
And there was some implication in Afghan Star that it was also because she was Pashtun.
Yeah,
But
Lima had she had the ethnic support, and by fluke she was the only Pashtun in the top 9, I think. And so she had that whole backing all the way up to that point, whereas Satara didn't have any kind of. She was Tajik, but she was never sort of identified in that sense. She didn't pay attention to that. She never talked about that when she was interviewed. She was sort of devoid of that. Her voice improved, but there were moments where it wasn't great, probably.
Some pitch problems.
Yeah, some pitch problems. So, you know, she was good, and she was controversial. But in a way, I think that Lima also did so well because Satara, people could, this is what I was sort of winning, was that people could sort of say Satara's awful, but Lima's great. And if Satara hadn't been there, people would have been criticising Lima. So I think.
But what about the backlash against her?
Lima, well, I mentioned it earlier, we don't know what happened to Lima, and there was a debate as to whether it was her family, you know, saying she shamed her family, or was it about ransom money and wasn't an income and that sort of stuff.
So it wasn't public backlash, it was...
There was, it wasn't a public, there was nothing public about it, it was
Okay.
Any other comment on
I think it's worth remembering that there's no Simon Cowell or Paula Abdul here. It's all voting, and it's voting in ways that we can suppose that there's ethnic voting. Pretty good reason to believe that, but we can't prove it. So it's kind of in the realm of speculation why someone gets voted off. I think one thing that hasn't been mentioned though, and that I'd be curious to have Havana talk about is. Early on in Afghan Star, there's a mention of that there are some very, very small number of women who are contestants at the first stage, like 6 or 3 women who are contestants, and how many males? 1,000 males. And so if 2 out of the last 8 make it are females, so that's an interesting phenomenon as well.
Yeah, they definitely put, the women went through that. The voting began in the top 10. There was lots and lots of sort of regional auditions and finals going down, sort of thing. But that was done by judges, not by text voting. And so the women definitely, those 2 got through regardless.
Yeah.
They weren't under the same sort of pressure, I suppose. It's very different kind of pressure.
In terms of your question, one thing I would say too, I'm reminded of a radio show that the BBC watched. Remember the name of the show that was so popular at the very tail end of the Taliban period and early in 2000? Yes. And it was such a popular show, and Afghans just ate it up. And it was a quality show, and it had a kind of didactic quality as well, that there were educational points were being made, and people rearranged their schedules so that they could be sure to be able to listen to it. So I think there is absolutely an appetite for quality programming.
Yeah, and you've mentioned lots of amazing films. Just during the elections, there was incredible coverage of the election debates every night. On part of the Toller Network as well as other channels. The Toller Network, which one I knew about, was doing fantastic debates, youth debate, things. So there's loads of appetite for it.
Yeah, the election coverage, which we were Havana and I were talking about earlier, we were both there. Summer of 2009 was amazing. It was nothing I've even seen in the U.S. in terms of really engaging people on multiple levels. But back to your question, it's something I'd like to see Tolo do with something like Afghan Star, and it's continuing into, I don't know, what season is it now? Yeah, but something I'd like to see is, you know, the news in general gave a good amount of coverage to Ismail Khan, who's a jihad era, pretty conservative Islamist type in Herat, but I would have loved to see programs maybe post Afghan Star after they air that, giving airtime to also progressive voices. And there are, and I think people like Professor Edwards, who's been invested in Afghanistan for a long time, there's a good number of prominent progressive voices in Afghanistan, like the Geilanis and other families. And so, you know, giving them a chance to come on TV and also be heard that this is a part of our culture to a certain extent, and that we do have a history of people fighting for these kinds of artistic and gendered expressions would have been ideal. But I think it sometimes works in the interest of, and I don't want to, you know, just say Tolo here, but I think it works in the interest of a good number of TV stations to kind of focus on some of the more extremist conservative voices, because then they can, you know, get more funding from the international community or more advertising money. But I think presenting, and this goes back to Afghanistan not being a backward country, presenting a more diverse voices from the left as well would be really important.
Yeah.